What if the person you admired most carried a lifetime of secrets, acts of courage, love, and sacrifice they never dared speak of? This funeral wasn't just a goodbye. It was the unraveling of a truth that shattered everything people thought they knew. What happened next? No one saw coming. The sun filtered through heavy clouds as mourners gathered at the edge of Alderfield Memorial Cemetery. A hush blanketed the scene, where grief whispered softly between the rows of tombstones. The crowd, a mix of family, former colleagues, and distant acquaintances, stood silently around the open grave of Jonathan Mallory, a man widely admired for his philanthropy and seemingly impeccable life. His name was etched into a flawless granite headstone, beneath the words, "A life built on love and sacrifice." Toward the back of the crowd stood a woman, older, graceful, and quiet. Her navy blue coat fell to her ankles, and her white curls peeked out from under a modest hat. In her gloved hands, she held a single white lily. Her eyes, rimmed with age and sorrow, locked onto the casket. While others exchanged soft greetings and stories, no one approached her. She remained still, a silent witness to a truth only she seemed to carry. Only after the minister offered the final blessing did she move. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward. The sound of her shoes crunching against the gravel was the only thing that broke the stillness. As the crowd instinctively parted, she walked to the edge of the grave and placed the lily gently atop the casket. Then she turned to face the onlookers. "My name is Clara Wynne," she said, her voice neither timid nor theatrical, just real. "I doubt most of you know who I am. But I knew Jonathan better than anyone here." A wave of puzzled murmurs spread through the mourners. Some looked at each other, eyebrows raised in silent question. Others leaned in slightly, trying to recall if they'd seen her before. Clara, undeterred, took a steady breath and continued. "Before this day ends," she said, her gaze calm yet direct, "you will understand who Jonathan really was. Not the man of ceremonies and donations, but the man who lived a life few of you could have endured." Silence fell. There was something in her tone, an unshakable certainty, that demanded attention. "I met Jonathan 52 years ago," she said, her eyes distant as if scanning through time. "It wasn't in this city, not even in this state. It was in Jackson, Mississippi. And I wasn't just some woman in the background. I was on the front lines, when simply existing in certain neighborhoods was enough to make you a target." The crowd seemed to draw a collective breath. "Back then," Clara continued, "Jonathan was a young schoolteacher. Not yet the man in the tuxedos and charity galas you remember. He was raw, fierce, and he believed deeply that the world could be better if people were willing to risk enough to change it." Her voice wavered, just a little. "That's where we met. At a church basement, planning a sit-in that could have gotten us arrested, or worse. Jonathan stood beside me, a white man in a black movement. He stood with us when it meant losing everything." Soft gasps spread through the crowd. Many had known Jonathan only as a quiet benefactor, a man who donated libraries and scholarships, but never as someone who had marched, protested, or put his livelihood on the line for racial justice. Clara let her words settle like dust. "We weren't just comrades," she said. "We were family, built not by blood, but by fire. When I lost my brother to a hate crime, Jonathan held me through the night. When he was disowned by his own parents, I was the one who helped him pack his things." Her hands, though steady, betrayed a tremor as she looked back at the casket. "We shared meals, secrets, pain. He called me his sister long before it was safe or popular to do so. And I called him mine." The crowd shifted uneasily. The image of Jonathan they held in their minds, polished, composed, quiet, was unraveling fast. And yet, no one interrupted. No one dared. "But the story I'm telling you," Clara said, her voice strengthening, "isn't just about our past. It's about what made him who he was." She scanned the sea of faces. Because the man you're mourning didn't become great in comfort. He became great through wounds you never saw. Another pause. In 1969, Jonathan lost his job at Lincoln High for speaking at a rally. They called it conduct unbecoming of a teacher. But what they meant was that he made people uncomfortable. He never told you, did he? Heads shook slowly. No, he hadn't. He didn't want your pity. He left town with 2 boxes and an old guitar. Lived on second-hand furniture and tutor wages. But he never stopped fighting. Clara's voice softened. And when my apartment was set on fire for hosting community meetings, Jonathan showed up before the flames had cooled. Drove me and my niece to Baton Rouge in the middle of the night. She turned back to the casket. That's the man I came to remember. The mourners stood frozen in reverent silence. Clara reached into her purse and pulled out a folded envelope. This, she said, holding it delicately, is a letter Jonathan wrote to me in 1975. I'd like to read just a piece. She unfolded the page with care, hands shaking now not from age but emotion. Clara, you are the sister my soul chose. We've endured what most people wouldn't survive. But if I had to do it again, I would. Because you taught me that family isn't defined by names or DNA. It's built by love and loyalty. And I thank God every day that you became mine. Her voice cracked, but she kept reading. You remind me why this fight matters. Why silence is never an option. And why I'll keep showing up, even when it costs me everything. As she folded the letter, a hush fell across the cemetery. Some mourners were crying now. Others stood still, their expressions caught between admiration and shame. Clara tucked the letter away. He never turned his back on anyone, she said. But I have to ask, how many of you truly knew him? How many of you ever asked? The weight of her question hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, unsettling and undeniable. The air felt heavier now, not just from grief, but from the realization that something enormous had gone unnoticed, hidden in plain sight all these years. Clara took another breath, her voice a little steadier, but still rich with meaning. There's more, she said simply. More than any of you probably expected. But this next part, this is what shaped everything Jonathan did in the decades that followed. Murmurs passed through the crowd again, low and uncertain. Clara's eyes locked on the horizon for a moment before returning to the faces in front of her. Jonathan carried a truth that almost no one knew. A truth that haunted him and drove him. You see, he didn't just fight for justice on the streets. He was also fighting a private battle, one that demanded more silence than courage. She looked down for a moment, as if gathering strength. He had a son. Gasps swept through the group. Yes, she continued, firm now. A son. Born to a woman he loved, but could never be seen with. Because in 1971, in the town we lived in, a white man with a black partner risked everything. His job, his safety, and even his freedom. The silence was nearly unbearable. His son's name is Marcus. And he's here today. From the back of the group, a tall man with rich brown skin and quiet strength in his eyes stepped forward. There was something unmistakable in his presence. His jawline, the curve of his brow, even the way he stood bore a striking resemblance to Jonathan. Heads turned. Some gasped. Others stared, stunned into silence. Clara placed a hand gently on Marcus's arm. Jonathan couldn't raise him publicly. Couldn't attend school meetings or show up for birthday parties. But what he could do, he did with all his heart. He paid for Marcus's education. Wrote to him every week. Visited when no one could see. He found a way to be present, even when the world told him to stay hidden. Marcus nodded once, his throat tight with emotion. He gave me everything he could, he said quietly. Even if he had to give it from the shadows. Clara looked at the group again, her voice filled with something deeper than sorrow, truth. That's the kind of man Jonathan was. He didn't just give when it was easy. He gave when it meant losing the very things he cared about. Some in the crowd had begun to cry openly now. Others simply looked away, ashamed they hadn't asked more questions while they had the chance. An older man near the front wiped at his eyes. I worked with him for 10 years, he said, his voice trembling. He never mentioned any of this. Why didn't he tell us? Because he wasn't looking for applause, Clara answered. He wasn't interested in admiration. He was interested in doing what was right. A woman in her 50s stepped forward, tears streaking her cheeks. When my daughter was sick and we couldn't afford the surgery, Jonathan made an anonymous donation, she said softly. I always wondered who it was. Now I know. And it means more than ever. Clara gave a slow, solemn nod. He helped hundreds of people quietly. Because he knew what it felt like to be overlooked. He never wanted others to carry that same burden. And slowly, as if waking from a long sleep, the crowd began to murmur. Not with skepticism, but with recognition. Faces lit up with memory. Voices whispered names, years, moments. I remember when he helped my brother get a job. He paid off my uncle's mortgage. He always said, if I can do something, I should. And he always did. Clara listened, tears welling in her own eyes now, but her voice stayed strong. Do you see it now? She asked. The man you thought you knew was so much more than his public deeds. He was a man who lived truthfully in private, even when it cost him everything in public. Marcus stepped forward again. He used to tell me, real love doesn't need witnesses. But real courage never hides it either. I didn't understand what that meant back then. I do now. Someone in the back of the crowd spoke up. He should have been celebrated for this. He should have been honored while he was alive. Clara turned to the voice, her face soft with understanding. He wasn't interested in statues or speeches. Jonathan believed that the real legacy you leave isn't built in marble. It's built in the people you lift up. The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the trees. And for a long moment, the crowd stood in reverent silence. Then Clara took a step closer to the headstone. She placed her hand on the cool granite, as if offering one final thank you. But I'm not finished yet, she said. There's one last story I need to tell. One final truth that will show you just how far Jonathan's love really went. Clara's eyes shimmered with memory as she turned back to the crowd. The final truth weighed heavy on her chest, but it was a burden she was ready, destined to carry. 2 months before Jonathan passed, she began, her voice a soft echo in the stillness. He called me. I hadn't heard his voice in weeks, and I could tell. I could tell he was tired. Not just physically, but deep in his soul. She paused, searching for the right words. He didn't speak of regret. He never did. But that day, there was something in his tone, urgency, maybe, or peace. He told me he was getting his affairs in order, not for himself, but for the children of this city, the ones without a safety net, the ones forgotten by everyone else. Some looked up, startled. Others leaned in closer. He was creating a trust, Clara continued, not for his estate, not to be remembered, but to ensure opportunity lived on long after him. Whispers moved like waves across the group. Clara gave a small, bittersweet smile. Jonathan told me, if I can't fix everything, at least I can plant something that grows beyond me. He wasn't talking about legacy. He was talking about responsibility. Marcus stepped forward again, his deep voice steady and grounded. That trust was finalized just days before he passed, he said. It's real. And it's already helping kids. Scholarships, mentorship programs, after-school support. Not just donations, but real change. The kind he never got to speak about, but always believed in. Clara nodded, her heart full as she turned her gaze back toward the crowd. He told me, this isn't charity. It's justice. A hush fell again. But this time, it wasn't silence born of shock or sorrow. It was reverence. He once told me, Marcus added, that every child deserves someone fighting for them, even when they don't know it. Especially when they don't know it. That's why he did it. Not for applause, not for headlines, just to make sure no child ever felt as invisible as he once did. An elderly woman near the front brought a hand to her mouth, eyes glistening. He never mentioned any of this. Not once. Clara looked to her, and her voice was gentle. He wasn't a man of words. He was a man of actions. She paused, taking in the faces around her. Many tear-streaked, some still in stunned silence, but all profoundly changed. And yet, despite everything he did, despite all he gave, so much of his truth stayed hidden. Another silence. Then Clara said, I suppose that's why I had to speak today. Because I couldn't let him be buried with only half his story told. Because if there's one thing Jonathan taught me, it's that the truth, no matter how painful or complicated, is what gives our lives meaning. Her voice cracked, but she continued. I watched him lose friends, jobs, even his family, for standing up for what he believed in. And yet he kept giving. He kept loving. He kept believing. She placed a hand over her heart. And if that kind of life doesn't deserve to be remembered in full, then what does? Marcus looked around at the people who had once thought they knew his father. His eyes filled with a quiet intensity. Your kindness toward him wasn't misplaced, he said. But now you know the rest. The late nights. The protests. The letters. The son he couldn't claim. The lives he changed. That's the man you should remember. Clara's voice softened again. So I ask you, now that you know who he really was, will you remember him differently? Will you tell your children the full story? Will you carry his spirit into the world? Not the polished version, but the one that burned bright and raw and real. The breeze picked up again, lifting Clara's words into the air as if even the wind didn't want them to fall. An older man finally spoke. He didn't just give money, he gave himself. Another voice followed. He gave hope. And then another, softer but no less certain. He gave us more than we ever realized. Clara stepped back from the grave, her eyes finding Marcus's for a moment. Then she looked out at the group once more. Jonathan's story isn't over. Not as long as someone remembers who he really was. Not as long as someone is willing to love the way he did. She turned to the headstone, her fingers tracing the carved letters one final time. Rest well, my brother. Your truth is safe now. As the last words settled over the cemetery like a benediction, the crowd stood motionless. Not out of ceremony, but out of something much deeper, respect. Reverence. A kind of awe. People began to look at each other differently now. Not with the familiar glances of neighbors or co-workers, but with the silent acknowledgement that they had all missed something extraordinary. Jonathan Mallory hadn't just been a philanthropist. He had been a protector, a rebel, a quiet warrior who fought for justice with every ounce of his soul, even if it meant hiding parts of himself to protect others. Clara stepped away from the casket, her movements slow but filled with purpose. Marcus followed, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between mourning and pride. The crowd began to stir. A man in his 30s approached Marcus, hesitating before speaking. My dad used to talk about Jonathan, he said. He said he was one of the few who'd listen without judgment. Now I get it. He really did carry all of us, didn't he? Marcus offered a quiet nod. He carried what others refused to. Another mourner, a young woman who had stood quietly at the back, came forward and took Clara's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving us the whole story. We needed to hear it." Clara looked at her, eyes heavy with emotion. "You needed to remember it." More followed. A chain of faces, names, people who had once known pieces of Jonathan's life now reassembling the full picture. Each one carried a memory, but now each memory had context, meaning, a depth they hadn't grasped before. And in that sacred space between grief and truth, something beautiful happened. The funeral turned into a reckoning, then into a renewal. People made quiet vows to live differently, to be braver, kinder, more aware of the struggles that often go unseen. They promised to keep Jonathan's story alive, not just in words, but in action. After some time, the cemetery began to empty. Marcus stood at the headstone, his hand resting on the cool granite. He looked at the inscription, "A life built on love and sacrifice," and smiled faintly. "Not even close to enough," he murmured. "But it's a start." Clara joined him, her voice soft. "He'd be proud of you." "I just wish I'd had more time," Marcus replied. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "You had the part that mattered, his love, his truth. And now, so does everyone else." They stood in silence for a while longer, just the two of them, honoring the man whose invisible battles had touched more lives than he'd ever let on. Finally, as the wind whispered through the trees and the light began to fade, Clara turned to Marcus and said, "Let's go home." They walked away, not as strangers or mourners, but as the living proof of Jonathan's legacy. We often think we know someone because of the image they present, the titles, the public accomplishments, the polite conversations at community events. But sometimes, the truest parts of a person are the ones they never speak about. The quiet sacrifices, the silent battles, the invisible love they give, even when it costs them everything. Jonathan Mallory wasn't a perfect man, but he was a brave one. And in a world that too often rewards appearances over truth, his story reminds us of something powerful, that real strength is often quiet, and real love sometimes goes unrecognized. Now that you know Jonathan's real story, who in your life might be carrying more than you realize? And are you willing to ask, to listen, and to truly see them? Leave us your opinion in the comments. It is very valuable for us to know your point of view. Thanks for listening to this story. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and turn on the little bell so you don't miss our next stories. See you tomorrow.